We love taking our beloved starter Pokemon with us into the competitive scene, only to be let down when they're not quite as good as we'd like them to be. For example, everyone who's ever gotten into Gen 1 is momentarily crushed to find out that Charizard is in fact terrible. When one of our starters is good, though, it's quite a rush. Those who got into competitive Diamond and Pearl were especially delighted to find out that the Infernape they beat Cynthia with was also a superstar in standard play. So we're celebrating the best of these starters, the ones that were so good that they were banned. But not just from standard play, no. We're including every gen and every tier here. It's quite a long list, so here we go. Ordered by generation of first ban, we're starting with Feraligatr in Gen 2 NU, Gen 6 NU, and Gen 9 NU. When Gen 2's NU tier was established, Feraligatr completely owned it. It dominated pretty much everything in the tier, being just about impossible to switch into safely. It could wield impressive offenses with either an all-out attacking variant or boosting with Curse, but it was at its most defining with its Rest Talk variant, which was impenetrable for pretty much the entire tier. Few Pokemon could switch into it, and few Pokemon could actually threaten it, and there wasn't exactly a ton of overlap between them. The best answer to Feraligatr was, that's right, your own Feraligatr. Rest Talk Gator Mirrors were a major aspect of Gen 2 NU for a long time, as in a manner not dissimilar to Snorlax and OU, your best bet at handling Gator was to stall it, since the metagame's low power level meant that it was nearly impossible to threaten offensively without Explosion, or Raichu, which was the other defining NU Pokemon that was only safely countered by itself. Of course, Raichu didn't comfortably switch into Gator Surf as it was 3-hit KO'd, so yep, better play it safe and go with your own Gator. Talk about a tier warped around one Pokemon. This dynamic was incredibly unhealthy, leading to Gator's ban to NUBL. Feraligatr started Gen 6 in NU and was quite decent, but upon receiving Sheer Force, it rocketed to levels of strength that automatically bulldozed the tier's base stat totals newly meager in the face of this power that was even being tried in OU. Its ban was prompt, uneventful, and matter of fact. Of course, you can't have this thing steamrolling the tier at the drop of a hat. Seeing as it would rise to UU through usage, it would have left anyway, but it did have the honor of the near instant ban. Finally, Feraligatr beautifully defied Gen 9's power creep. Not only did it not fall to PU, as you might expect such a Pokemon to, but it actually pulled off the NU ban hat trick. With Terastallization, it was scarier than ever. Dealing with such a powerful Pokemon already tends to be a needle-threading exercise, as if you aren't perfectly precise, Dragon Dance Feraligatr will just blow you away. But now being able to Terra Dark made it even more terrifying. Not only did it remove its electric and grass weaknesses, making it more difficult to revenge kill thanks to its still solid natural bulk, it also gained the super boosted crunch that, alongside Sheer Force and Life Orb, the latter not even proccing recoil thanks to the former by the way, Feraligatr performed stupendous feats of strength, dropping even something as bulky as Vileplume with mere Stealth Rock support. As such, Feraligatr has been banned from both Gen 2 and Gen 9 NU, which is pretty amazing, and in Gen 9 it was banned alongside Deoxys Defense of all Pokemon. What a concept! It'd make the player base of any previous generation think that they were going insane. And speaking of insane, our next Pokemon is Blaziken in Gen 5 and 6 OU and Gen 8 and 9 UU. The first starter ever deemed too powerful for an OU tier, Blaziken was a source of great scandal and outrage in early 2011 when its speed boosted high jump kicks and sun-fueled flare blitzes got it canned from standard play before other monsters like Sandvale Garchomp, Sandrush Excadrill, Thundurus Incarnate, and Deoxys Speed. How can this Pokemon that loses to something as pedestrian as the move Aqua Jet possibly be broken? Such was the question posed by the philosophers who were unimpressed by the destruction wrought by this monster that was obscene even by Gen 5 OU stratospheric standards. Surely this was going too far, right? Banning a starter Pokemon? They're not supposed to be overpowered. But lo, though this conspiracy against the fully fledged Torchic that had carried so many through the Hoenn region had people fighting in the streets or message boards, Platos had yet to gain the experience necessary to fully appreciate the ideal manifestation of destruction that Blaziken had become. High-powered dual stabs off of a high-powered attacking stats that quickly spiraled beyond revenge-killing reach through the speed boost that launched it past even fast Choice Scarfers, while effortlessly able to make itself stronger through tactics like Swords Dance and Eternal Sun, though these were more bonuses to really push it over the top. You couldn't wall it, you couldn't outrun it, it was a fast, lethal one-hit KO machine. It didn't help that Sun also tended to interfere with the efficacy of the occasional attempted Aqua Jet revenge kill. This carried over it into X and Y, where it was briefly allowed at the very beginning of the generation, alongside its newly gained Mega. But just like it didn't need the Sun that was no longer permanent this time around, Blaziken didn't even need the Blazikenite to crush everything in sight, and it was banned almost immediately. In Gen 7, it wasn't even taken off the ban list, which is why we didn't include it in the blurb. You can't have the action of getting banned performant on you if you're never allowed in the first place. place. And why would you want to let loose Speed Boost Blaziken with Z moves at its disposal? You wouldn't. After this stunning 3-gen run, Blaziken was allowed again in Gen 8. And not only that, it dropped to UU. There, it did effectively what it had done when it first appeared on the scene, utterly throttle the metagame. Its Swords Dance set being especially vicious at getting it banned to BL, and eventually it rose back up to OU through usage, proving itself quite excellent there. Gen 9 came around, and Blaziken understandably dropped to UU again, but now with Terastallization at its disposal, it got banned again. Remember the whole what if Blaziken had Z moves thing? Well, Terra was basically that, but even more extreme. Most teams' best answers were letting it KO itself through accumulated Flare Blitz recoil, which was of course a completely reasonable price to pay, as it only cost you 3 Pokemon or so, but somehow Blaziken was removed from the tier alongside Latias and Iron Hands, just like how Greninja was removed from Gen 6 OU. In X and Y OU, Greninja was a terror. Its power was one thing, it hit much harder than its already good special attack would suggest, thanks to Protean giving it stab on literally every attack. This Omni Stab was bolstered by a cornucopia of colorful coverage, letting it threaten nearly everything in the game. And as if that weren't enough, it also got to throw down spikes, limiting its already limited pool of answers that were capable of taking it on over the course of a game even further. Plus, you could pull some really dirty tricks with it, like spiking in front of a Rotom Wash on an attempted Volt Switch. Of course, you could also smack it with Stab Hidden Power Grass, but what really made Greninja alarmingly arduous to answer was its extraordinary speed, as it outran even the Tornadus that was already notable for outpacing Alakazam, which was itself considered incredibly fast. You struggled to out-offense Greninja, and you struggled to take its hits. Pretty much nothing was safe, except for Clefable, which was bulky enough to take 2 Life Orb Hydro Pumps, and feared none of Greninja's coverage, and was even immune to spikes thanks to Magic Guard. It was incredibly popular at the end of XY OU as the one actual answer to Greninja. Then Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came around, and you know how Clefable feared none of Greninja's coverage? Yeah, now Greninja had Gunk Shot, so that was over. This pretty much single-handedly launched Greninja over the edge. When Clefable couldn't counter it, nothing was safe. It sure didn't help that Gunk Shot also let Greninja obliterate Azumarill even more easily. As such, Greninja became the first starter banned from OU in its debut generation. Though our next Pokemon on our list would have to wait a gen to be banned, with Serperior, who was banned from ORAS UU and Gen 9 RU. ORAS Serperior having finally received its long-awaited contrary ability that turned its Leaf Storms into nasty plots, rose to OU, where it became one of the most powerful, despised Pokemon in the tier. However, before it got the usage to do so, it was also banned from UU, as unsurprisingly, the tier was completely ill-equipped to withstand the sort of inverse Blaziken, a fast Pokemon that only got stronger the more it spammed its most powerful move, with a support move pool most infamously including Glare and Leech Seed, suddenly allowing it to make mincemeat of Grass Resist. It was sent to the BL tier that it wouldn't last long in, alongside fellow UU banned no-brainer Terrakion. Even Gen 7 was another amazing OU generation for Serperior before it took Gen 8 off. When it returned in Gen 9, there was excitement over it being able to utilize Stellar Terra, as its more powerful Terra Blast would work in tandem with Contrary to give it a special attack boost instead of drop. But it being typeless and Terra reliant to work meant Serperior would no longer be dominating OU. It was UU for a long time, but eventually it dropped to RU. Everyone was instantly terrified of it. Goodra seemed to be the only answer, and even that could be overwhelmed in classic Serperior fashion. Actually, with Terastallization, no, not Stellar, Serperior was even more obscene. Terra Ground made quick work of Alolan Muck, for example. It felt like it'd be a matter of time before it was banned. When, not if, as this felt like an incredibly obvious ban with how this incredibly fast Pokemon was also dropping everything in sight. Fortunately, RU didn't have to put up with it for long. Serperior wreaked havoc, yes, but on its 4th day in RU, it was quick banned, with everyone breathing a sigh of relief. Next up, we have another fast grass type with Sceptile and ORAS NU, Gen 7 RU, and Gen 8 PU. With the release of ORAS, excitement over the broken new Megas led to some of the less immediately exciting ones dropping quite low, leaving Mega Sceptile to tumble down in NU. This, of course, didn't last long at all, as it got canned in a hurry, and would go on to establish itself as a major UU threat. But very briefly, Mega Sceptile terrorized any NU team without Mega Altaria. Eventually, Megas were uncoupled from their base forms in terms of tiering, which led base Sceptile to drop to NU, and it was a terror. Whether it was immediately launching monstrous Choice Specs or Life Orb Leaf Storms off of its excellent speed, or taking time to set up in order to clean games up with its powerful, truly impossible to outspeed Swords Dance Unburdened. It was consistently a source of controversy, and eventually got a suspect test that led to its ban. It was simply so fast and strong that it towered over the rest of the tier. Mega Sceptile had a similar deal in the following generation, no longer quite hacking it in UU, as it found itself in RU, but though that tier was now stronger, it was still no match for the utterly astonishing speed and vicious dual stab that Mega Sceptile wielded. It cleaved through the tier effortlessly. It wasn't quite the most instantaneous ban in the world, but it didn't even last 2 weeks before it was voted on, with resounding unanimity sending it packing to RUBL. Come Gen 8, Sceptile found itself in PU, but there it also took on one of its most frightening guises yet. Its Unburden set was even scarier since it could be activated automatically through terrains and corresponding seeds, but even without the controversial DDF in the tier, a Sceptile whose Unburden was activated upon switching was incredibly scary. It was hardly restricted to the set either, and not only were its Life Orb and Spec sets as powerful as ever, the fact that they had such vastly different answers made Sceptile a nightmare to check, let alone counter, leading to its ban to PUBL. And speaking of ban-worthy Pokemon, we of course have Typhlosion next on our list. NU was undergoing some serious volcanic activity with the release of Oras. Eyes initially shifted to Mega Camerupt. Any Mega is going to get a lot of attention when it drops that low, especially one as over-the-top powerful as Camerupt, but the player base was similarly terrified of Typhlosion, which was using its infinitely superior speed stat to launch devastating eruptions. It was so strong that it melted even resists. Of course, Eruption was only devastating when Typhlosion was at full health, i.e. before it had to deal with Stealth Rock, but a sub 100% Typhlosion was far from neutral. Its speed stat was great for the tier, and it wielded it just as effectively to threaten the metagame with Fire Blast and coverage. You'd be forgiven for thinking of it as the type of button-mashing, type chart nullifying Pokemon, but what really pushed it over the edge was how deftly it could add utility to its game too. Typhlosion's go-to answer was Thick Fat Assault Vest Hariyama, which was quite decent at withstanding fire attacks early in the game, but when Typhlosion pulled out Will-O-Wisp, it was absolutely ruined, seeing as Assault Vest Hariyama was relied on to check a whole host of special attackers and how necessary it was to stop Typhlosion from turning the rest of the tier into barbecue. Typhlosion was similarly a scorching wall breaker and an amazing lure for one of the metagame's most integral defensive pieces, which made it superb team support as well. Typhlosion was so scary, it transcended its non-existent defensive profile as its switch-ins were limited, but each one was so ruinous for the opponent. Typhlosion's best use defensively was to use its new Flash Fire ability to switch into other Typhlosion. Yeesh. As a result, Typhlosion was banned from NU in the same move that also removed Mega Camerupt from the tier. Typhlosion then performed basically the same feat in the next generation's PU. Its power was absolutely absurd relative to its tier's power level. It was like Groudon had been dropped into a metagame with a bunch of NFEs, almost feeling like cheating for how automatically its eruptions one-hit killed everything in sight. Except for other Typhlosion, of course, because that's a healthy dynamic to have in a tier. It was banned almost immediately in the tier's earliest stages. Typhlosion basically had the strength of a Mega Pokemon, just like our next Pokemon on our list, Mega Venusaur and Gen 7 UU. Most of the time, Pokemon receive the ban hammer for being offensively overwhelming, and make no mistake, Mega Venusaur and Gen 7 UU was quite threatening. However, what really pushed it into troublesome territory was the fact that it was an utter colossus defensively, incredibly hard to break, and breaking through its superb bulk was particularly challenging, specifically because it also exerted such major pressure offensively. Oh, it's only got 8 synthesis PP. Doesn't that make it exploitable? Not really in OU, and definitely not in the UU that scrambled to leave a scratch. It just takes hits so well, and one of its primary stabs in the health replenishing Giga Drain, to say nothing of how it also loves throwing around another one of the best moves in the game, Leech Seed. Compounding this impressive tanking ability was Thick Fat, making it neutral to fire and ice, which would normally be its most exploitable weaknesses. Forget threatening it with Infernape or Mamoswine. Oh, taking Mega Venusaur hits isn't enough on its own. You've also got to contend with the nasty, not at all unlikely possibility of a Slush Bomb's 30% poison rate. It outlasted and overwhelmed just about the entire tier. It may not have had the flash and bombness of a fast, automatic one-hit KO sweeper, but its impact was seismic, and amidst the game desperation to not crumple under the weight of all the many different ways that it could ruin you while you failed to leave a dent in its hide, it was banned from the tier. Just like our next fat Pokemon, Emboar from Gen 7 NU and Gen 9 PU briefly. The third and least renowned firefighting starter was still a notorious threat in the lower tiers that it occupied. Excellent in the RU of Gens 5 and 6, it met its eventual move down to NU in Gen 7 by unleashing a brutal barrage of reckless boosted fury on the tier. Its classic Choice Scarf and Band sets continued the immediacy of threat that they were so renowned for. The former was uncommonly strong for a Scarfer, making it a potent weapon for auto-dropping opposing offense, defense, while the latter was a wall breaker of peerless viciousness. These sets had their counterplay to tactics like Protect and Regenerator, but that's where Emboar's new tricks came into play. It brutally punished its usual responses with Bulk Up, which alongside a corresponding Z Crystal, pushed it to obscene levels of unwallability. The assist to its physical defense sure didn't hurt, but the real star of the show was how with either Fightium Z or Electrium Z, it absolutely shattered seemingly good checks like Gastrodon, Slowbro, and Altaria, leaving it answered by just about nothing defensively. Any team that dared to have a slower Pokemon for the defensive stability Emboar would then upend anyway. The Big Pig was banned. Emboar also spent some time banned from Gen 9 PU. With Terastallization, it basically repeated its Gen 7 NU act to terrifying results, except now its Bulk Up set was even more difficult to revenge kill when it could flip its type on a dime, especially because its bulk was excellent relative to its surroundings, while its Scarf set's stabs boosted further made it even more uncommonly automatic at crushing healthy Pokemon that were by no means frail, and the ban set reached comical levels of overkill. Emboar found itself banned to PUBL, and then it actually rose to NU, but just a couple months later, it returned to a rather different PU tier, and though it started out well, it declined over time until eventually it didn't even have the usage to officially remain PU, making it untiered. Still, it was banned for a time, and in the unofficial tier below PU, ZU, Emboar was also banned for trucking through everything, so we can give it an honorary shout for its destruction there. And speaking of destructive fire types, we have everyone's favorite starter, Charizard, and Gen 7 PU. Following in Typhlosion's footsteps, Charizard was on the Gen 7 PU player base's radar in the earliest stages of the tier's development. In fact, as it was touted as particularly elite from the start, it mystified players with how long it managed to remain in the tier without so much as a shadow of a test looming in the background. But once the more egregious elements of the tier were gone, it became clear just how insane Charizard was. Its powerful sets were all amplified by how varied they were, making it much more difficult to answer before you knew what it was running. And even when the set was revealed, it didn't get that much easier. It could blast away with the immediacy of choice specs that at its best came close to approximating Typhlosion, while it could also boost its speed several different ways, from Dragon Dance to the terrifying Z Sunny Day to the real backbreaker Z Celebrate, which on top of the power and speed boost also made Zard bulkier, which in conjunction with Roost meant even if you could outrun it or withstand its first hit, that didn't mean you could actually beat it. Forget the quadruple Stealth Rock weakness. Once they were wise to Charizard's true power though, they rightly banned it to PUBL. Next we have another banned iconic starter with Cinderace in Gen 8 OU twice. What if there were a fire-type Greninja, except it's actually a bunch of different types thanks to its Protean ability, but it's not technically called Protean, so it's fine? This difficult question was bravely answered by Game Freak in the form of Libero Cinderace, which pushed boundaries in existential thought and OU metagame brokenness alike, in conjunction with the heavy-duty boots that performed the astonishing feat of transforming a frail Stealth Rock weak Pokemon into a borderline immortal threat, allowing Cinderace's ferocious offensive assault to bombard the opponent repeatedly in a sort of eternal ruin. Fittingly named the Vortex by the player base for how Cinderace and his teammates effortlessly trapped opponents in chain sequences of spam switch moves like U-turn. Cinderace's Omni-Stab antics were as dangerous as they were risk-free for the user, even as one seemingly safe answer, Hippowdon, could lose to bulk up high jump kick sets, with Cinderace's type shifting anticipating Terastallization, lose the Earthquake weakness, gain a Fighting Stab. Of course, it didn't need to beat Hippo itself, as in the Isle of Armor metagame, it could and usually did U-turn out to another broken metagame, Specs Magearna. Both Magearna and Cinderace were banned, then returned a few months later in the Crown Tundra. Surely this expanded Pokedex would make it easier to withstand Cinderace's ferocity, right? Nope, it ran circles around opponents just as happily as before. If anything, it enjoyed the influx of major threats that it can now partner up with and U-turn out of. You couldn't even safely revenge kill it with faster Pokemon. Cinderace would be all too happy to greet your Specs Dragapult with Sucker Punch. As such, it performed the unique feat of getting banned from its debut generation a second time, and prompting Game Freak to nerf Protean and Libero in the following generation. And speaking of Gen 8 bans, we have Primarina from Gen 8 UU. Primarina had a stellar debut in the UU of its inaugural generation. Its choice specs feared for how utterly impossible it was to answer without a Blissey or Empoleon, and even Empoleon could be worn down. Enter early Gen 8 UU, which had neither, leading Primarina to promptly be placed on the chopping block. Amoonguss wasn't even around to slow down its stabs. Primarina could threaten it with Psychic, of course, but now it was especially free to toss around its Hydro Pumps and Moonblast with impunity, especially since it had such an easy time hitting the field with its excellent natural bulk and top Tapu Fini typing. It was genuinely impossible to switch into and wound up banned alongside its fellow monstrous offensive water Gyarados. Primarina didn't even remain banned, as the limited early decks opened up in subsequent DLCs, leading it to once again establish itself as a UU star. But in those early days, the metagame was completely incapable of handling it, just like how Gen 8 NU was completely incapable of handling Blastoise. Shell Smash isn't necessarily enough to break a Pokemon in the lower tiers. Look at Turtonator, for example, which for all its good points is so fundamentally flawed that it can't even scrape into PU. When you give Shell Smash to an actually decent Pokemon though, utter chaos. For years, Blastoise was a source of major controversy in Gen 8 NU. It was self-evident in how dangerous it was. Great offensive defensive typing, great natural bulk, good speed and special attack. Of course, this thing's gonna be a game ender. These types of Pokemon tend to be natural targets for toxic bans. It's too strong, too fast, making it too effortlessly lights out with such limited counterplay, meaning it can deck healthy teams at the drop of a hat. Blastoise was following in a time-honored Pokemon tradition. However, the flip side of this tradition is that there are also many that act like dealing with such a monstrous Pokemon is easy, actually, because it has checks. And have you ever thought of using them? Sure, Blastoise had answers, just like literally every Pokemon, but the inherent vice of Shell Smash is that it was simply too extreme in what it did. Blastoise at Team Preview was a Sailor Take Warning Sky. No matter what your method of handling it was, it threatened to upend you with ease, whether through adjustment of its set of Brute Force or with Dark Pulse, a 20% flinch. As a result, it was finally suspect tested and it received the boot to NUBL, shortly before the release of Scarlet and Violet. Next up, we have another water type with Inteleon in Gen 8 PU and Gen 9 PU. Inteleon's fast, powerful water type offense would have absolutely throttled an earlier generation of OU, let alone the lower tiers, but it's not so impressive anymore. However, once you get it down to PU, oh boy, this thing is a lower tier Greninja, wickedly fast and strong, even packing the endless utility of U-turn in case it doesn't feel like immediately destroying you with its Specs Hydro Pump. This may come as a shock, but 125 special attack and 120 speed tends to rip through the low base stat totals known to populate the PU tier. Inteleon thoroughly shattered the tier in Gen 8 so easily that it was almost boring, as might happen when you've got something that both outspeeds and immediately one-hit KOs most of what it's going to come up against. Even Gen 9's power creep didn't stop it in this regard. Inteleon returned to PU and was actually even more brutal. Despite the tier having quite a nice selection of genuinely bulky Pokemon this time around, including a collection of waters like Milotic and Gastrodon that ordinarily would shut Inteleon down hard, Inteleon now brandished Terra Grass to utterly obliterate them. Alternatively, it could U-turn on these jokers and rock Terra Water to propel its Hydro Pumps to preposterous pinnacles. Forget checking it with raw special bulk as you ordinarily would through something like Assault Vest Galarian Slowbro or Especially Defensive Florges. Intelligent, well thought out strategy, considered tactics, more like ha-ha Hydro Pump, leading Inteleon to back-to-back bans. But there's an even better water type a generation later with Quaquaval. Quaquaval's offensive threat is really singular. It's got Keldeo Stabs, base 120 attack alongside Swords Dance, Water Stab that boosts its speed, and Moxie as an ability, meaning that if it KOs an opponent with its Water Stab, it gets a Dragon Dance for its trouble. Though simply being able to boost attack for dropping something with close combat is an extraordinary reward on its own. It's so good, you almost don't even need to notice that it got the incredible utility of U-turn and Rapid Spin, the latter of which also boosts its speed in addition to hazard clearing duties. Oh, and it's got Encore too? Who can keep up? With such an embarrassment of riches, it was only a matter of time before Quaquaval made trouble somewhere. Indeed, upon receiving knockoff in the Teal Mask, it was officially too much for UU. It was already a superb physical sweeper. There was simply nothing Quaquaval couldn't do. It had enough great moves that 2 sets would struggle to fit them all. Oh, and it gets better. Quaquaval was eventually unbanned, and it seemed to be too good a fit for UU after all. Surely you just have to learn to play around its snowball potential, right? Wrong. Quaquaval allows you to withstand it just barely until it decides what would most amuse it would be to destroy the tier again. It feasted on the influx of Weavile and rendered UU hapless in the face of dance moves that Mirror B would be proud of. As a result, Quaquaval was banned for the second time in the same generation. It pulled a UU Cinderace, but with style, causing trouble like its fellow Gen 9 starter Meowscarada. Throughout Gen 9, Meowscarada oscillated between OU and UU, excelling in both. However, eventually, UU said we're not going to wait to see if OU takes it from us again. We actively want it out of here now. The latest in the Protean starters, Meowscarada rips things up even with the nerf version of the ability that only activates per the first move it chooses upon switching in. Its speed is incredible, beating out even its predecessor Greninja and its strong base 110 attack, meaning its excellent physical move pool is hitting harder whether or not it's got stab on them. The always crit Flower Trick, the eternally reliable knockoff, and the triply terrifying triple axle are going to smack just about anything for solid solid damage at the very least. Triple Axle becoming especially frightening if it gets the Protean boost. Oh, and Meowscarada's packing U-turn as well. It shredded UU because it outran everything except for Deoxys speed and outlasted its few answers in true Cinderace fashion. That is, if it went with heavy-duty boots, it could also throw a choice band on for truly untoward carnage. Meowscarada mowed UU down with a vengeance and got banned not too long after its fellow Paldea starter Quaquaval's second ban. Next, we have another very powerful grass type with Rillaboom. After a superb debut generation as Tapu Bulu's U-turn, knockoff, and priority spamming successor, in spite of the nerfs to the grass type power under the terrain it summoned, Rillaboom was once again a solid choice in Gen 9 OU, both posing a threat itself and enabling a multitude of strategies for its teammates, and more specifically, Grassy Seed unburdened style threats to more general earthquake weakening and passive recovery. Rillaboom dropped to UU for some time, but eventually rose to OU for its excellent utility there in the Teal Mask DLC. Roughly a year and a half later, it rejoined UU, and immediately there was chaos. Grassy terrain fueled some seriously frightening monsters. Unburdened Hawlucha was to be expected, but there were also new beasts to abuse the terrain in Grassy Seed Latios and Tail Glow Manaphy. The problem wasn't just that grassy terrain was there, it was that Rillaboom was so good at setting the terrain that it made matters even easier for these Pokemon that didn't exactly struggle to hit the field. Rillaboom was far from an overbearing Pokemon in its own right, but it was far from a slouch. In fact, it was predictably very good. And the way it combined its solid offensive capabilities with such tremendous wheel and deal support for such extreme threats warped UU something fierce. Not 2 weeks into its reintroduction to the tier, Rillaboom was banned. To enable these threats and have such an excellent Pokemon was just too much. If the player base wanted to abuse grassy terrain, they'd have to use Thwackey. And in fact, people would rather use Thwackey than our next grass type, Torterra in Gen 9 PU. Remember how Blastoise demonstrated how bonkers Shell Smash would be if given to an actually decent Pokemon? Well, even in Gen 9, where it can feel like everything has something on par with what was previously a uniquely outrageous boosting move, this holds true for Torterra, another shell-bearing Pokemon finally given the opportunity to Hulk out on a lower tier that was unprepared for such wrath. It was an NU for a long time, but eventually dropped to the lowest tier. And there, well, it got banned a lot quicker than Blastoise. There was no multi-year back and forth over whether its presence was healthy, but rather a panic to get it out of the metagame as soon as possible, because this thing was one of the most effortless win buttons the tier had ever seen. Torterra was both incredibly straightforward in what you knew it was always going to do, and then it mixed different Terras and coverage into the equation, and the already minimal pool of answers tended to disappear very quickly under the full crushing force of a +2 blast, Terra or otherwise. The most reliable answer was Ditto, aka throwing Torterra back at the opponent. Of course, Terra didn't just make it more frightening offensively, but defensively as well. Forget picking it off with something like Arcanine's Extreme Speed when it Terra Ghosts on you. Torterra utterly dominated Gen 9 PU and was quick banned for its efforts. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.